Hi guys, I'm Eve, a finance student at Peking University, and today I'm going to be teaching you guys how I learn Mandarin. Right now what I'm doing is I'm kind of like reading this book on my laptop. I typically like to find different texts, different books. I'm actually challenging myself to read like a full-on book right now in Chinese because I've read short stories before and stuff, but I feel like it's not the same. But I do have this online database where I can just go on and read the text, and it's a pretty decent size, and I feel like the story with it itself is pretty interesting. And so if I ever come across like any word that I don't know, then I'll just go ahead and write it down in my Google Translate list. And I transfer those vocabulary words in my Google Translate onto my actual note-taking document so that it's like a system that I follow. So it's first take the word off of the actual story that I don't know, put it into Google Translate so I know what it means, and as well as the pinyin and how it sounds, and then I put those words into my notes, and then I make those notes, and then I also make vocab lists to go back and review the words, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. Because on Google Translate, if you didn't already know, you can actually write out the word like in text, and then it'll just kind of like translate it for you, or like make it into like the actual text on the screen. So like let me show you guys what I'm talking about so you can get a better idea. So for example, like here I was wanting to write, I guess, like 奇怪, strange, 奇怪. Then I could just go and write that, and then I'll write it here. So what I do is I take the text from my screen and I write down what I see, and then I'll just have that list, and then I can go into my actual note-taking vocab list and add all of these words, as well as the pinyin for the words that I don't know, which I think is a very helpful tactic. So essentially, once I have compiled my vocabulary list, or the list that I've gathered from the information that I've got on the story, I will then transfer it to my note-taking app, which I've also made a video on how I take notes. If you're interested in that, you can check that out afterwards. But so I essentially will write down the key phrase, and I do think that it's actually really helpful to learn through phrases rather than learning through specific individual words, because then you actually remember the phrase in context. And so now I'm going to run you guys really quickly through how I write out the pinyin and then go back and actively recall the words for the list. So essentially when I do this, I will have to have both split screens that I'm using on my actual vocab list, because now at this point we've already translated all of that information and all of those vocab words onto the note-taking list. And so for example, I've written down multiple phrases here of the different words that I'm trying to learn, and then I will have the pinyin of the word that I'm not sure of, or the word that I'm unfamiliar with. Then if I don't know the pronunciation and I don't know the actual definition either, then I'll write the pinyin, and I'll also write the meaning of it in red. The words in bold are the initial sentence that I wrote out, and then at the bottom with the less bold font is where I actually practice writing out the phrase or vocabulary that I was trying to remember or commit to memory. I also have a vocab list where it's split in my layers here, where I have different layers of the different things that I've read, and then here I have vocab. And this is still pretty premature. I haven't really added too much to it because I just adopted this strategy. And now what I'm doing is just trying to actively recall the notes that I've already taken and the words that I've already learned, because if you learn it once, it typically doesn't stick in your brain. So I have to constantly go back and review these words so that I actually know that I'm remembering them. Essentially, now what we're going to do is we're going to have list 1 and list 2. And so now I'm going to be adding to list 2 with my red pen for the pinyin. And so let me see where I finished with list 1. So list 1, I stopped with 大街小巷道是少了许多人. So let's go and find that. Oh, okay. So here we have from last time where it was talking about 大街小区. So I know that that's the vocab that I stopped at. So now we're going to go on to the next one. It's right here. I guess the main thing here would be 整天足不出户. So then I would go and write 足不出户. And then for the next one, which would be in the bold, it would be 荡阳起 would be the main vocab, but then I also have 波浪. So at that point, I feel like I would just include almost the entire phrase. And I typically won't include the accents for this part because it's just mainly seeing if I recognize like the word and the pinyin, and then I can align it with actually how to write that word. And so the tones aren't as important for me, but if you're someone who really wants to learn your tones well, then you could also include that here. I'll just continue going through this with all of the bolded words here, and then I'll show you the end product because this is going to take a little longer than you might think. And so now that I finished with writing out my list 2, I can now go back and kind of add in the words in addition to the pinyin that I already have. And so these words that I got from my initial vocabulary practice area were words that I learned a day or 2 ago, and so they're not super fresh in my mind, but I do still have an idea of how to write them. And so I think this is a great way to practice active recall and also spaced repetition and remembering the word that I've already learned a day or 2 ago and refreshing myself so that next time I go around I won't even have to think about it and I'll just know it for sure. And I will say that when I'm reviewing, writing down the pinyin for the list, my vocab list that I'm reviewing for, then that's also simultaneously I can't obviously just look at the pinyin, I have to look at the word too. So as I'm creating that list, I'm also kind of refreshing my mind on how to write the word. I'm obviously not fixating on how to write that, but I think it's also helpful because that way I'm kind of testing myself twice in one study interval, and I think that's very helpful for sure. So now I guess I can just show you guys kind of how I go about doing that. And so for here, this is list 2 that I've created, and now I can just go back and try to recall the information. So obviously there will be times where I don't actually remember the word when I'm recalling it, and that's the whole point, because if I notice that I don't remember, then I'm oh shoot, and then so in that case I would just go back and look at my original list where the word is, and then just kind of remember, and then write it down on my list 2. And so then I would just go and take my purple highlighter and just highlight it really quickly, and the next time I go about reviewing this list, I'll be sure to pay more attention to that and make sure that I really do know the word. And I think this strategy has just been very helpful in allowing me to kind of actually learn things and such. And I do know that some people will like to use flashcards and stuff for learning, but I think that for me, I just it's hard for me to be super consistent with flashcards some of the times, and so I find this method to be more helpful. But I do have a friend that does use flashcards, and he finds it pretty helpful as well, and just going through the flashcards on a regular basis and making sure that he actually learns what the word looks like, what the word sounds like and such, and going back and reading the text actually that he got that vocab from. So that's also another strategy that I think that you could try out. And obviously I feel everyone learns differently and processes information differently. So what works for me might not work for you, and what works for him might not work for you, and what works for you might not work for us. But the point is, I think you just need to kind of explore and experiment with language learning, and obviously it might be different if you're a beginner in Chinese and how you learn, but I think that this tactic really works with anything. Just if you're reading a text, even if it's very simple basic text, just taking that text, any words that you might not know, and writing it down, and then figuring out what those words mean, what the pinyin is, and then trying to practice and test yourself to see if you can eventually learn how to write that word, and the next time you see it, you'll recognize it and you'll know the meaning, and that's just kind of how you build up your vocabulary and such, I suppose. For general language tips, I would honestly just really recommend trying to expose yourself to the language as much as you can, because at the end of the day, a language, you learn it to kind of communicate and to be able to express yourself in whatever manner you so choose to. And so I think it's very helpful to try to speak as often as you can, even if you're just talking to yourself. In the past, I would record YouTube videos, or not YouTube videos, I would record videos of myself speaking to the camera in French when I was learning French, and I found that was actually very helpful in terms of improving my ability to speak in the language, and also just kind of going back and watching the videos and seeing any grammatical errors that I may have made, because I feel when you're actively speaking, you might not really recognize it, but then when you go back and look at it yourself, then you're oh, okay, I made these mistakes, and then later on you might more naturally be less likely to make those mistakes because you kind of reflected on those mistakes, and we're actively trying to improve your overall ability. And obviously, when you're speaking in a language, grammar isn't the most important thing, but I do think that it's something that you should also kind of consider when you're learning a language and trying to perfect your skills in language, because it doesn't always deter you from being able to communicate effectively, but I think it never hurts to have those additional like grammatical rules understood. And then aside from that, I do also really recommend listening as much as you can, because I feel like listening is obviously another big thing for languages. And how I do that, or how I did that for French, was I would kind of watch French news or French YouTube videos. There would be French vloggers, and I would kind of listen through that. And honestly, I'm considering doing like a vlog in Chinese, because I feel like that might be kind of cool for anybody who also wants to learn Chinese or Mandarin or whatever. So there's that. But side note, I'm getting sidetracked. And then additionally, for Chinese, when I was learning Mandarin, I would watch C-dramas, and I still do to this day, but I do think that kind of helped me maintain my listening ability when I wasn't studying in China, obviously, because in the household I am Chinese American, but my parents often, we communicate in English because, you know, sometimes it's just easier, or like Chinglish will often be used in the household as well, so which is like Chinese and English combined. But I do think that getting that listening practice is very, very crucial. And then also just kind of like, I don't know, I just guess in general, consistency is very important, obviously. Consistency and like being deliberate about why you're learning it and how you're learning it, because without those two things, then it's kind of like, even if you're consistent every day and learning language every day, if you have like no goal, then you're like not really working towards anything, and I feel like it can get pretty like tiring in that sense. So those are essentially my language learning tips and how I have been learning Mandarin, Chinese, and I hope that they have helped you in some degree. If you enjoyed this language learning video, please let me know. I honestly did enjoy making this video, and I feel like it's pretty fun to help people kind of learn how to learn languages too. And if you guys want any more tips or have any questions, please feel free to let me know. If you enjoyed and would like to follow for more content similar to this, or follow me on my journey as a international student majoring in finance at Peking University, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys next time.